Um, Thank you very much indeed for that. I want to begin by drawing on your experience as UN Emergency Relief Coordinator in relation to a rapidly escalating humanitarian crisis today, and that's Syria. We have, some of you here will have been involved in it, a Disasters Emergency Committee appeal being launched in this country tomorrow. The DEC Chief Executive, Saleh Said, today said this of the appeal, which is both for humanitarian activities inside and outside Syria. There are huge and unmet needs both in Syria and in the surrounding countries. In Syria, the greatest challenge to meeting those needs remains the barriers to delivering aid, which are faced by impartial humanitarian agencies such as our members. The lack of funds are also a critical constraint. The DEC give the current context: 1 million Syrians fleeing to neighbouring countries, further 2 million trapped in Syria itself, where the health systems collapsed in many areas, water supplies disrupted, and food often in short supply. Alongside that, US and UN officials told a Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee yesterday that women and children are suffering the worst horrors in Syria, with many subjected to rape and sexual violence. Now, all of those remarks touch on issues that very much run through your book, in particular, barriers to delivering aid, access to the people most affected, sexual violence against women, and that striving for impartiality by humanitarian agencies. If you were still the UN Emergency Relief Coordinator today, what strategy would you be trying to pursue with regard to Syria?
Nice, easy question to start with. Well, I mean, obviously, I'm not engaged in Syria in the way that I was when I was the Emergency Relief Coordinator, although I do have a little bit of contact through the International Rescue Committee, because I'm the chair of that NGO here in the UK, and I did visit Jordan a few months ago to talk to Syrian refugees, so I have a little bit of practical experience there. I think if I was still there, I would be trying to do, to be honest, what my successor is trying to do, Valerie Amos, which is somehow trying to make sure that enough aid is delivered to people on the ground, and that's both in the government-held areas and in the rebel-held areas, and that's, of course, extremely difficult. And to do that by maintaining some kind of relationship with the regime in Damascus. I mean, you know, she is still talking to the regime in Damascus about how you get aid into particularly the government-held areas, but also how you can get across those lines.
How do you do that in these circumstances? They've been extremely reluctant to see aid, and increasing.
Well, they have agreed. I mean, as I say, I'm not an expert, and there may be people in the room who are more expert on this than I am, but the regime are allowing a certain amount of aid from the UN to be, and one or two NGOs as well, to be distributed in the areas they control. And I think they have allowed one or two convoys to go across the lines into cities which are rebel-held, if you want to put it like that. At the same time as that is happening, you have a number of NGOs who are delivering aid across the border. I mean, there's obviously aid for the refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, and so on, but there is aid being delivered across the border into the rebel-held areas. So there's a kind of balance being struck, a sort of unofficial division of labour, and I think that's quite a sensible way of playing it. Now, it may get much more difficult than this if the regime suddenly say, as they might do, that the international community is completely against us, they're completely biased, and therefore we're throwing you all out. But I mean, I think it's important to try and, and this is one of the themes of the book, obviously, to try and stay in where you can, even when it's extremely uncomfortable and you're having to deal with people who you would much rather not have to deal with.
What view do you take on the desirability or otherwise of external military intervention, which would presumably be framed, if it were to happen, in terms of protecting civilians and making it more possible to deliver humanitarian aid?
I think this is a really difficult question. I mean, I think the humanitarian organisations don't call for military intervention as a matter of practice, because they're very fearful of the unintended consequences of that, and we've seen very many examples of that. So I think the humanitarian community is going on calling now for a political solution, and of course that would be the ideal. Now, the reality is, I mean, talking just as a sort of observer of Syria now, not in any kind of official role, or not as a humanitarian, as it were, I think you can see now that the idea of a political solution looks a very long way away indeed. The only solution looks like being a military solution of one sort or another, and frankly, the only likely outcome is the eventual fall of the regime. So that's when, although I'm, and as I say in the book again, I'm not an interventionist by and large. I mean, I have great reservations about many interventions that the West has carried out. I mean, not just Iraq and Afghanistan, but others too. And the risk of unintended consequences is very high. And I have not been in favour of intervention in Syria. But we may have reached the point where, in order to bring the conflict to a more rapid end and therefore hopefully spare more lives, I mean, it's a bizarre way of putting it, if you like, but I think there is some realism in it. It may be that the least of all evils is to start to arm the rebels a bit more. I mean, there's a whole other argument about whether you want to go down no-fly zones and so on, but that's a much more serious step. So maybe arming the rebels would shorten the conflict. But I mean, I'm not saying it's a panacea, and maybe it would also give, if you could arm the right rebels, and that's a very big question if you know who the right rebels are or if they even exist, that might give you some more influence over what happens after the conflict. I mean, for the moment, I would say that the situation inside Syria is appalling, much worse, I think, than we recognise even now. And despite what you were saying about the DEC appeal. And even if the conflict finished tomorrow, we will be I think Syria will be in an extremely risky, fragile and dangerous situation.
But even doing it by arming the rebels rather than a full-scale external military intervention, I mean, that throws the whole issue of the protection of civilians into even sharper relief, doesn't it? And that's something that had come about under UN auspices, the UN General Assembly resolution on protection of civilians 2 years before you took up your job. Can you foresee that today's UN Emergency Relief Coordinator, Humanitarian Coordinator, would be able to exercise any real powers, any authority in terms of protection of civilians if it escalated militarily in that way? Or do you just have to step aside at that moment?
Well, you don't step aside, you do what you can, but civilians are not being protected now in any way. The vast majority of the people who are dying are civilians. Particularly from the government attacks on civilian areas, which have been completely indiscriminate in all sorts of ways. So to imagine that you're going to somehow magically be able to protect civilians in those circumstances, particularly if the war gets even worse, is illusory, obviously. But that doesn't mean you give up. You try to do your best. You can try to remind all the participants of their obligations to protect civilians throughout such a conflict, and hope that has some influence, however marginal it may seem at times.
Well, we'll come back to that in other contexts that it came up during your time in just a moment. Let's go back to the beginning and that description that you give of yourself as an accidental humanitarian with that background of yours of many years in diplomacy, but not specifically in humanitarianism. Tell us about that phone call you had from Tony Blair and how it ended in your accepting this job with its built-in high risk of burnout.
Well, I mean, the story is, as I tell it in the book, that I was leaving Paris. I've been ambassador in Paris for 5 years, or a little bit more than that, and I was leaving and didn't quite know what was going to happen to me next. And I got a phone call from Tony Blair, who I had worked for at an earlier stage when he was first Prime Minister, who said they wanted someone to go to the United Nations to be the senior British person in the United Nations, not the British representative, because in theory that doesn't happen. Because a new Secretary General was coming in, so he was appointing new people. But of course the job he was talking about was the Under Secretary General for Political Affairs, which was a job that the British had held for a number of years in different people and with great distinction. So I said, well, I'll consider it, and I flew off to New York to talk to Ban Ki-moon, who was then the Secretary General designate. This is late in 2006. And to my surprise, he said, well, that job isn't available. He didn't say this, but he'd actually given it to the Americans for different reasons. And he said, but I think you'd be very good, as Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. And to which I replied, well, I don't know anything about humanitarian affairs, and I'm not sure I'm the right nationality. The British reputation at the time was not at its height because of Iraq and all the rest of it. I said, maybe, I think you perhaps need a more cuddly nationality, like Norwegians or Swedes or Dutch or those kind of Canadians,
Anybody want to defend themselves against
that? But he said, no, I think you'd be very good, and I've heard good things about you, and I like the British, they're always sensible. So, why do you think about it? So I said, not very sort of positively, I'll think about it. So I went away and I did think about it, and I talked to people who knew about the job and people who knew about humanitarian affairs. And they persuaded me that it was a good job. It was actually a better job than the Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, which is true, by the way, because I think you have more ability to influence reality and events on the ground. And they also convinced me that maybe having a diplomatic background was actually an advantage, not a disadvantage. I mean, obviously, it's not an advantage to know nothing about humanitarian affairs, but that ability to understand the politics of situations was an advantage. And I think that actually, I mean, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think it did prove to be the case in the end.
It seems obvious, and I think you say this yourself in the book, really, that the most controversial episode of your time as Emergency Relief Coordinator was the closing stages of the war between the Sri Lankan government and the Tamil Tigers, the LTTE. And within that, in particular, that decision that you were very much a party to pull out UN international staff from the one region up in the north where the Tamil Tigers have been pushed back in the latter part of 2008. And the report, since you wrote the book, I think you finished the book in the middle of last year, didn't you? Then after that, as you will well know, came the report of the Secretary General's Internal Review Panel on United Nations Action in Sri Lanka in November last year. And among other things, that talked of quotes, a grave failure of the UN to adequately respond during the final stages of the conflict and its aftermath to the detriment of hundreds of thousands of civilians. So with hindsight, could there have been an outcome with fewer humanitarian consequences? Were mistakes made on the UN's part and indeed on your own part?
My honest view is that we couldn't have prevented what happened, whatever we had done. Because you have to remember the basic context, that there was a government which was absolutely determined to destroy the LTTE militarily, whatever the cost, to them in lives and to other people's lives. And they were not listening to anybody who was arguing anything to the contrary. They were not listening to the UN. They were not listening to Western countries who were trying to put pressure on them. And they, to be fair, not to be fair, you need to remember that they had the support very strongly of a lot of members of the Security Council, the Russians and the Chinese, and actually most of the developing world, who took the view that a government had the right to deal with the domestic terrorist movement, as they saw it, as they saw fit. That was the political context in which you were operating. People talked a little bit about the responsibility to protect at that time, but it was perfectly clear no one was going to intervene militarily. There was no question of that happening. So, that was the context, and that's why I knew what the political context was. That was the context in which we were operating. Now, there were lots of questions which arise within that. We did withdraw, this is in September 2008, if I got the year right, when it became, the government said they couldn't be responsible anymore for our security, but also it was perfectly clear the LTT were not going to be very cooperative with us either. Now, you can argue about whether we should have withdrawn at that moment or whether we would have been forced out, as we would have been very shortly afterwards. I think, it wouldn't have made much difference, to be honest, because the fighting was going to intensify so much that we wouldn't have been able to stay, in fairness to our own staff, much longer in any case. The bigger question, and that's very much the question of that in that report, is should we have focused more clearly on advocacy, to use the sort of humanitarian term, in denouncing the government for what they were doing, and the LTT, of course. The LTT were holding the civilian population as human shields, effectively. 300,000 Tamil civilians in the most cynical way possible. So they, and firing on those who were trying to escape. The government, as I say, were absolutely determined to finish the war off militarily at whatever cost. And therefore they were using heavy weapons and airstrikes and mortars and so on, in an area where they knew the civilians were, and where they knew there were going to be large numbers of civilian casualties. Now, we did constantly criticize them for that publicly. We constantly talked to them about that privately, saying this is unacceptable. So it wasn't as if we weren't making those points. Now, I took the view at the time, that we we needed to do that. We needed to try and influence them privately. We needed to try and influence them in areas like what was going to happen to the Tamil civilians afterwards. Were they going to be kept in camps forever, or were they going to be allowed to be released? Were they going to be looked after when the war eventually ended, as it clearly was going to? And therefore that we needed to stay engaged with the government in order to try and influence that, in whatever way we could, which with the limited influence we thought we had. So that's why we stayed engaged, tried to maintain that balance, walk that tightrope between keeping the operations going on the ground and using our bully pulpit and our voice to try and influence what the government was doing through that. Now, the report suggests that if we'd spoken out more loudly, maybe that would have had more influence on the government. Frankly, I don't believe that.
Do you think that's the case?
I don't believe that.
What the critics were, and indeed, as you said, it comes up in that report, were suggesting was that you had I think you challenged us and say the figures for those who were in the area, even more so the figures for those who had been killed, civilians who'd been killed, were becoming increasingly unverifiable, which was one reason why you stopped giving out figures. But there are those who argue that however difficult that might have been, it would have helped in that situation if you had given yourselves, endorsed others' figures. That would have kept up the pressure on the international community, those who, as you've just been saying, seem reluctant to act. And indeed, had you, despite all of the great difficulties that your staff were facing there, had you been able to stay in a bit longer, you would for longer have been actual witnesses on the ground to what was happening. Have you revised your views on that at all as time has passed?
I understand why the people say that, and this is a legitimate area of debate. I'm not saying I have all the wisdom on my side. Just to go back to whether we could have witnessed it more, we didn't stop working after withdrawing. We actually sent convoys into the area of aid for a further few months. And actually we had to stop that because the convoys themselves were being shelled and people were being killed. So
and they got trapped in the fighting.
And they got trapped in the fighting. So I'm not sure we could have made a lot of difference there, frankly. If we'd tried to stay in longer, we wouldn't have been able to. That's my point. The other point about casualties is that, as you say, at a certain point, I think in April 2009, we said we had been giving casualties up to that point, our best estimates. We stopped giving them because we weren't present on the ground and information was extremely unreliable. And some people, including some people within the UN, accused us of deliberately suppressing those casualty figures, which we knew to be true, in order to spare the government. Now, I absolutely reject that accusation. We did not do that. But we, at a certain point, didn't think we could actually say these were the right figures because we didn't have enough information to verify them. Now, I say you can argue about that, but we said...
But was it not so horrific at that point that it was worth giving its impact on civilians in particular?
Well, let me just
it was
finish
worth
what I was
giving
going
figures,
to say.
but making the point that you couldn't.
Well, we could have done
them.
that. And I mean, actually, the figures were used by the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So the figures were out there anyway. They weren't, whether they were right or wrong, they were out there anyway. And we continued to say the figures of casualties are extremely high and unacceptable. So, whether you said they were 3,000 or 4,000, they were extremely high. People were being killed, tens and hundreds a day, were completely unacceptable. So the argument that somehow people didn't know this was happening because we weren't giving that exact figure is nonsense. People did know what was happening, but they didn't want to do anything about it. So I don't think we could have prevented what happened had we used those figures or not. And if you look at what's happening in Syria now, to go back to the present day, the figures are being used. 70,000 people killed so far. I don't know how reliable they are, but they're probably in the right order of things. Has that stopped it happening? Has that influenced the way the debate has gone? Not really, to be honest.
But is there an argument for, we come back to the word you used a moment ago about advocacy? There comes a point where your job as humanitarian coordinator does, as limitations increase, does become one of advocacy, or is that a role you felt you should resist?
No, it's always one of advocacy, but you have to balance. This is a balancing act, which I hope most humanitarians will recognise, between advocacy and operations on the ground. Humanitarian organizations are not human rights organizations. Human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch or Amnesty, can afford to indulge in pure advocacy. They're not normally present on the ground. They can't normally be thrown out. It doesn't matter whether they're thrown out because that's not going to affect whether aid reaches people or not. If you're a humanitarian organization, you have to be there on the ground in order to help people. So you have to find that balance between speaking out and maintaining the operations on the ground. Because if you speak out and you're thrown out, the people who will suffer are the civilians you're trying to help. That's the dilemma. And you normally, and I think rightly, but this is arguable, the humanitarian imperative is what prevails, and you stay in there. However uncomfortable it may be, it will be easier psychologically and personally maybe to go out in a blaze of glory and denunciation, but that's not going to help the people on the ground at the end of the day.
Again, I think you point this out, but numbers are so often an issue, aren't they? They were in Sri Lanka, but they are in many other conflicts and humanitarian situations, and argued over furiously, governments playing down the scale of suffering, and indeed on the other side, some of the more overtly campaigning agencies may be going for numbers that will catch the attention of donors and the public, the higher figures. In the midst of all that, do you see an argument for some kind of more formal recording mechanism, whether it's for casualties or for people affected, and which presumably there'd be an argument that could, if there were such a more scientifically recorded mechanism for recording numbers of people affected, that could help also in targeting the humanitarian response. And particularly, I think that's the case when you've got hunger, when you've got potential famine, isn't it? To make sure that you can deal with that. Numbers are extremely important, one of the factors. How high a priority would that have for you, from your experience, whether it's Sri Lanka or whether it's any other?
Are you talking about numbers of people affected and those kind of numbers, or
yeah, numbers generally,
or automatic recording of abuses and war crimes or whatever?
In all contexts, but particularly casualties, and particularly particularly people affected and in need or deemed to be in need of food aid, for example.
I mean, they are two different things. If you get the numbers
wrong, if there's not a scientific basis for doing it, very often the aid itself can then be distorted.
Well, of course, it's hard to be scientific usually because information is usually lacking to be absolutely scientific, whether it's about casualties or about numbers. My view was always that it was very important for humanitarian organizations to tell the truth as they saw it. And I occasionally got angry with other organizations which wanted to exaggerate for effect in order to attract money and to attract attention, because that may work in the short term. Ultimately, it destroys the credibility of appeals and using numbers like that. So you need to be telling it like it is, even if it's not the easiest way to a quick headline. So that was my...
give us an example of a crisis where you felt that occurred.
Well, I don't want to name the organization, but I remember in Myanmar, a particular organization said, if aid isn't got there in the next week, 30,000 children will die. Now, there was absolutely no evidence for that assertion. I mean, it was a very dramatic assertion and it made a headline, but there was no evidence for it, and it was almost certainly not true. And I thought that wasn't actually helpful, because it was going to be unhelpful for the credibility of that particular campaign, and unhelpful for the credibility of subsequent campaigns as well. Shroud waving is a very difficult area for humanitarians. You need to be very careful about doing that. Similarly, for example, to talk about food security areas, you need to be very careful about when you use the word famine. Famine has a particular definition, rates of malnutrition and so on. It should not be bandied around casually, as the media sometimes do, and maybe one or two organizations have done at different times. You need to reserve it for when it really is a famine, and then when you ring that alarm bell, as the UN did in 2011 in the Horn of Africa, then there can be a very quick response, because it means something and it's not been used too casually. We need to get the numbers right. Casualties actually don't affect humanitarian aid, really. The number of people dead doesn't matter, because you're trying to help the living more than the dead. But there can be very difficult situations. To give you another example, in Ethiopia, and I think I talk about this in the book, in 2008, 2009, the organizations on the ground said that 6 million people were in need of food aid. And the government said, we don't accept that figure. We think it isn't that many. And why did they say that? I think it wasn't because they had different information. It was because they didn't want to affect their image. They didn't want to go back to the image of the 1980s as Ethiopia, a country always subject to famine. They didn't want to affect inward investment, which was their priority. So that we then had to kind of fight that battle about figures, but stand our ground about what we had established by our actual reports and reasonably scientific analysis.
Let's turn to Darfur. We mentioned it briefly just a moment ago, and there, of course, we have a conflict and a humanitarian crisis that, as you say, often seems particularly intractable and long-running. And again, a government that you had great difficulties in dealing with. And also at times there have been the same complex arguments there about whether aid workers should remain, and you had to deal with expulsions too. Also in Darfur, there's that constant tension that you talk about between peace and justice. And of course, we have the ICC indictments in your time in the job in 2008 against President Bashir and all the consequences of that. Though I do note today that he has said in 2 interviews that he does intend to step down by the end of his term in 2015, saying Sudan is in need of fresh blood. So what effect that will have on his ICC indictment, if he carries it through, I don't know. Indeed, yeah.
I don't suppose he said he was going to The Hague, did he actually?
He didn't know. Now, it's often said, as you know, that there can be no peace without justice. You disagree with that, but why do you disagree with that?
Well, my experience came from, or opinion came from two particular experiences. One is in Sudan with the indictment of President Bashir, and the second was with the indictment of the leaders of the Lord Resistance Army, which started in Uganda and then spread into Congo and so on. So the pursuit of justice in those two cases, and I'm not arguing about the justification for the indictments in either case actually, did that actually aid peace? I don't think it did, because I think in the case of the leaders of the LRA, in particular Joseph Kony, the leader of the LRA, who's still out there somewhere, still causing absolute havoc, it is possible, not certain by any means, but possible that if he hadn't been indicted by the International Criminal Court, he would have signed the peace agreement which had been negotiated and come in and given himself up. But he refused to do that, and it may well be that he refused to do that because of the International Criminal Court indictment, which couldn't be removed. It couldn't be removed by the Ugandan government, which wanted to remove it, and had started the process of indicting him, because that's not the way the International Criminal Court works. Now, I say I'm not doubting whether he justified the indictment, but in practice, there wasn't a peace agreement. He's still out there. Hundreds of thousands of people, probably millions of people, have been the victims of him continuing to be out there. So, although I totally accept the need to end impunity for people like him, and the culture of impunity which allows leaders to get away with these things, the effects certainly in the short term may not be very productive.
So,
if I can just finish, with President Bashir, again, I'm not doubting particularly whether he justified the indictment or not, but it seemed to me at the time that the indictment was the jump from relatively minor leaders on the ground to President Bashir might have been taken more for political reasons than for judicial reasons. In any case, was indicting him likely to make peace in Darfur more probable? Frankly, no. Now, I'm not saying there would have been peace if he hadn't been indicted. I don't think there would have been. And let me just complete the thought. We have had peace without justice in Northern Ireland. And I was involved in that, in the sense that in order to make a peace agreement possible, we agreed, as the British government at the time, to release prisoners who've been legitimately convicted in both cases, both on the Republican and the Loyalist sides, in courts of law, because that was the way to make a peace possible. So all I'm saying is, I'm not saying that peace and justice are opposed concepts. They're not. But the easy mantra that they go hand in hand is not, in many cases, true. And we just need to recognise that and be realistic about it and not pretend it's true.
I think what I'm not clear about is what exactly you're arguing for here. Are you arguing for more selective use of ICC indictments, and particularly that they should be delayed or not used at all if there seems a remote prospect of, or if it seems likely they will undermine peace efforts in the near future? Do you think they should be used even more politically perhaps than they are at the moment? Or?
Of course, I'm not trying to argue the opposite, that they should be withheld for political reasons. But I think if there are indictments which are made for political reasons, that can be a problem. But all I'm trying to point out in the book is that I'm not attacking the ICC. I'm not attacking the idea of justice at all. I mean, of course not. And in the long term, you need to have justice and reconciliation in most situations to have peace. All I'm saying is there may well be situations, and we've seen some, where if you were to pursue peace to its, justice, I should say, to its ultimate end, you might destroy the peace in the process. So, you just have to know what you're doing and understand that that's the reality of it, rather than pretending that it's all fine and as long as you're pursuing justice, peace will come by itself. It won't.
You mentioned the LRA leader, Joseph Kony, and as you say, he's still eluding the forces of 4 nations from time to time, and indeed with American assistance as well, extraordinarily. The initiative for his indictment by the ICC, of course, came from the Ugandan government, which is an interesting feature there, isn't it? And you have very much had to deal with, in your time, with the humanitarian impact of the LRA's actions. Now, in his case, you appear from the book to argue for a rather different form of justice. You put the case for, and to quote you, taking Kony out. Some people might find that rather surprising language for a humanitarian.
Well, it was, and it is. And of course, taking out can mean 2 things. It doesn't have to mean
tell us what it does mean.
Killing. It can mean getting him out of what he's doing at the moment. The point I was trying to make was, I was very, very struck when I went to northeastern Congo, where Kony and the LRA were operating, by the impact he'd had on, literally hundreds of thousands of law-abiding innocent villagers, just with a handful of men with Kalashnikovs and machetes. And the appeal that the people in those villages they said to me, "Are you telling me, you represent the United Nations, you telling me you can't do anything about this man? You can do anything you like if you want to." I didn't have a good answer to that, to be honest with you. And we, expended vast amounts of resources pursuing Osama bin Laden, ultimately successfully, and very little resources pursuing Joseph Kony, who did far more damage than Osama bin Laden could ever do in terms of human consequences. So the point I was trying to make was that there was a case for a Security Council resolution which would have authorized anybody who wanted to take action against him, using all means or whatever the usual Security Council language is, for a Security Council resolution which would have authorized countries, any country which wanted to do it. It didn't happen, and I regret that it didn't happen, and I regret that he's still out there.
Is one of the features in the frustrated conclusion of the search for him, is it the difficulties of coordinating strategy across borders? As we've said, there are the forces of 4 nations involved, of South Sudan, of Central African Republic, DRC, and Uganda. But I've heard it argued that that's a real problem. And indeed, if there is, in his case, do you think that's quite commonly the problem, where you're dealing with the humanitarian fallout of a crisis that goes across borders, is the difficulty of getting, particularly if it's bad relations across the borders, the difficulty of getting coordination, does it affect the humanitarian response as well?
Well, coordination is always a problem in humanitarian response, and that's what the job is supposed to be about. I think the particular issue in Kony's case is that you have 4 countries. One, the Central African Republic has no capacity to do anything about it at all, certainly not in the south of the country. Congo has a certain amount of capacity, but actually very little. The Ugandan forces had a certain amount of capacity, but They ran up against the sovereignty issues in the Congo, and South Sudan had so many other problems that this wasn't going to be their priority. So, one of the problems was the sovereignty issues of the Congolese government saying we don't want other people coming in to do our business, but then nobody did it in the end. The Ugandans are saying we've sorted this out now. We're just conducting mopping up operations. Well, they said that 5 years ago, and that's a lot of mopping up since then. So that sort of issue arises, but that's not so much about humanitarian response. That's about and military response to Coney.
Absolutely. I was thinking also of the broader point, because you're the UN humanitarian coordinator here. You're working to some extent with the UN system within each individual country. So I'm thinking of a systemic thing here. Has it often been difficult to bang heads together to get the kind of coordination you need for an effective, swift humanitarian response in an erupting crisis where you're dealing with different sort of territorial responsibilities within the UN system as well as the governments of those countries?
It isn't usually a territorial problem. I mean, there can be issues where you have a regional problem, and Syria now is a regional problem. You've got to make sure you're responding inside Syria and across the region, and the same was true in Iraq in the aftermath of the Iraqi invasion. The coordination problem is not usually that. The coordination problem usually comes from the fact that, as everybody in this room knows, the humanitarian system is very fragmented. You have a lot of UN agencies. You have the Red Cross family, which is quite extensive in different ways, and you have a large number of NGOs. So all of which are independent, all of which have their separate mandates, their separate governance structures, their separate ideas, their separate ways of doing things. In order to make the humanitarian response reasonably effective, they have to be coordinated. Now, if you were designing a system with a blank sheet of paper, that's not what you'd finish up with. But that's what we have. That was the reason for the job, and that was the reason for some of the difficulties and the frustrations.
Sure, we'll have follow-up questions on that and just about everything else in a moment. But another 5 minutes or so before we open it up to you. And it struck me from reading the book that if there is this tension between peace and justice, we've just been talking about, obviously another recurring theme is the tensions between political and humanitarian objectives, and especially the integration of humanitarian aid into political security and these days stabilization strategies, which is very topical for you in your time in Afghanistan and Somalia, but it's extremely topical today too, and much more in the Britain's political agenda. And that debate about whether this is to integrate it in that way as a perfectly proper use of humanitarian aid, or whether it compromises humanitarians and increases the risk to them and the work that they do. So drawing on your practical experience, what are your conclusions about that?
Well, I think it's clear that if people try to integrate humanitarian operations and humanitarian aid into their political and security strategies, you can't deliver humanitarian aid properly in those circumstances. It simply won't work. It's got to be based purely on need. It's got to be based on independence from politics or race or religion. And it's got to be based on neutrality between the warring parties in the case of a conflict, whoever they may be and whatever they may represent. That's the ideal. I mean, of course, it's not always easy to achieve that. And one has to be realistic about the context in which you're operating. But the principle has to be that those principles which are there should be respected. They should be respected by the donor governments. They should be respected by the governments of the places in which you're operating. And they should be respected by the non-state actors, the Taliban or Al-Shabaab or whoever it might be, who are also controlling territory or influencing events where you're operating. So that is where we should be, and that is where we should stay. Now, that's not so easy to achieve if you're, as we were trying to coordinate the system from within the United Nations. The United Nations itself is not always a neutral actor. Take the situation in Afghanistan. The Security Council has mandated the United Nations as an institution to support the government. Our position as humanitarians, humanitarian organisations within the UN, was that we would give aid to people who were under government protection, but also aid to people who were living in areas which were not controlled by the government. Now that poses obvious problems, and that's why we needed to disintegrate ourselves from the rest of the UN in order to try and do that job properly. Now,
how difficult was that?
Extremely difficult. I mean, it's difficult because Other bits of the UN didn't understand why we wanted to do that, because they thought we were just fragmenting the UN effort. Difficult because Western governments didn't really understand that either, because they thought, why can't we have an integrated strategy? Obviously coordination is better than not coordination, including with the rest of the system. So getting that argument through was quite difficult. And one of the points I make in the book is that humanitarians have not been good at explaining why we need to do that. And that's not because we're sitting on ivory towers on principles which don't match reality at all, but because you can't actually deliver humanitarian aid safely and effectively if you don't have the consent of the people you're trying to deliver it to. And you can't have the consent of the people you're trying to deliver it to unless you're seen as delivering it for the right reasons and not for political and strategic reasons.
And aside from Afghanistan, where and which governments have you seen trying to co-opt or integrate the humanitarian aid into a security stabilization strategy,
well, obviously,
in a way you regard as dangerous?
Well, Pakistan was another example where the Pakistani government would have liked to control the humanitarian aid much more than they could, and where it was complicated because the military were in charge of the domestic humanitarian operation, which had its advantages because it meant they were efficient and not corrupt, but disadvantages because they were military actors. Somalia was another example which you mentioned, and it wasn't so much the government, because the government, certainly when I was there, scarcely existed, but where there was, the humanitarian aid got mixed up with the war on terror, which is, when you get into the biggest problems. And Afghanistan is the place where, these lines between political objectives, security objectives, development objectives, and humanitarian objectives, and the actors who were delivering them became the most blurred and the most dangerous. And they still are, by the way. It's very, very difficult to disentangle them. And those are the examples we need to avoid. Now, I'm not talking so much, there's a whole separate agenda about what the Sudanese government wanted to do in terms of manipulating humanitarian aid. And their idea was always, well, we don't mind these people giving out food and water and medical care, but we don't want them talking about abuses or sexual violence, because we don't think that's what they should be doing, and that's political. So that's why we have to insist that protection of civilians is a legitimate part of humanitarian aid, just as much as delivering the basics of life.
Let's look to the future before we open it up for discussion. I know that a favoured phrase now is the humanitarian landscape rather than system. You say in the book, many others argue there needs to be a better connection between humanitarian aid and the addressing of chronic problems, and that if left unaddressed adequately, you then get fresh crises and the need for more humanitarian aid. And Sahel is perhaps a prime example of that at the moment. But for all the talk of that, it still seems to be fitful rather than a systematic approach. How do you think more can be done to achieve what you want to see happening on that front?
Well, there is still in the system, whether it's the UN or other organizations, a sort of divide between humanitarian aid and development aid. And it's there in the mentalities of people who deliver it. Humanitarians have to do things very fast. Development aid needs to be very carefully considered and over long term. It's there in the funding mechanisms, which tend to be one thing or the other. And it's there in some of the institutions, which are one thing or the other, although many organizations do both. But even where they do both, they tend to have a humanitarian wing here and a development wing there, and they don't really talk to each other very much. And that's obviously, if you think about this from the point of view of someone on the ground, do they understand that distinction? Of course they don't understand that distinction. It doesn't mean anything to them. So we need to overcome that in all sorts of ways, which is much more difficult than it sounds, and the fact that it hasn't happened despite all the talk about it suggests that it's actually very deeply ingrained in habits and attitudes and cultures. But if you look at take the example of the Sahel, and the example I tend to cite is Niger, which had a population, I think in 1950 of 2 million. It's now 15 million. In 2050 it will be 50 million. Which is now going through, it's always had droughts and always had problems, but those droughts are becoming more frequent and more intense because of climate change. And of course, the bigger the population grows, the bigger the pressure on the environment. It's not only the number of people, it's the number of animals, because that's the way they do their agriculture, which are also destroying the environment. Now, my point about that is that the humanitarian system, landscape, whatever you want to call it, can just about deal with the worst of the disaster consequences when there's a drought, as there was in 2010 and as there is again now, actually. But unless you actually address the underlying problems at the same time and with the same degree of urgency in terms of managing water, retaining water, producing alternative livelihoods, different ways of agriculture, controlling the population if you possibly can, although that's extremely difficult. Unless you can address some of those issues, the humanitarian aid it's not wasted because it's saving lives, but you're going to have to be doing it more and more often, with less and less, or more and more donor fatigue for obvious reasons. Or public donor fatigue anyway, because they say, well, why are we paying again? You know, we had a drought 3 years ago. Why haven't you fixed anything in between? That's where we haven't got it right, and that's where we have to start thinking about, addressing these issues.
I mean, you say the point seems pretty obvious, really, doesn't it? So, and has been well made by many. So, how do you get donors more signed up to that approach?
I wish I knew. I think I was, trying. I think we just have to go on making the argument and pointing to the examples where it's most glaring. Yes, you need to address the humanitarian consequences, and you need to address them immediately and urgently and with resources. But unless you're addressing the underlying consequences, the long-term issues, with the same degree of resources and urgency, then you're wasting your time.
One last quick question. What was your worst day in the job and why?
There were so many. I think the most frustrating time I had was over Haiti, which was a natural disaster, not a conflict. But because it should have been not easy, it's never easy, but it should have been possible to mount a better operation than we were able to mount. In a place which was not a million miles from anywhere. It was 2 hours flying time from the US mainland. But somehow making things happen in that country for all sorts of reasons, which I won't go into, was extremely difficult, and still is, by the way. And so the frustration of that, and it was particularly under very heavy media scrutiny because CNN was there 24/7, reporting 24/7 from Haiti for quite a long time. And it was extremely difficult to get across to them, and I could understand this, why, if they had the reporter there, why there couldn't be, hundreds of tons of food aid there as well. Now, if those who've been engaged in this know that those are two different things. But it was just very difficult to get this aid effort moving, in a place where people were in desperate need.
Good. Thank you very much indeed. And so now indeed we do open it up, not just to all of you here, but also to those who are following this online. What we will need to make that happen and to keep everybody involved is if you in the audience here would state who you are and any organizational affiliation that you have, and also just wait for the microphone as well. And I'll look out for some questions that are coming in from online. So within the room, who's first? Let me just start over this side. If you're there, if you just wait for the microphone.